What if I told you that the technology the entire AI revolution is built upon, the one governments are fighting over, the one Nvidia turned into a trillion-dollar empire, the one investors treat like the beating heart of the future, might not actually be the future at all? Not slower, not less powerful, wrong. Wrong in the same way steam engines became wrong when electricity arrived. Wrong in the way film cameras became wrong when digital sensors quietly slipped into our pockets. Not because they stopped working overnight, but because someone somewhere discovered a fundamentally different way to solve the same problem. Because while the rest of the world has been obsessing over squeezing more electrons through impossibly tiny transistors, a team of researchers in China claims they've stepped sideways out of that race entirely. They aren't pushing electricity harder, they're using light, actual beams of light, photons carrying information, performing calculations, and potentially completing certain AI tasks up to 1,000 times faster than Nvidia's most advanced chips while using only a fraction of the energy and generating almost none of the heat. 1,000 times, not 1,000%, 1,000 times. Now, before we get carried away, and trust me, this story deserves both excitement and skepticism, I want to give you the whole picture. The impressive parts, the uncomfortable caveats, the fine print hidden beneath the headlines, because the truth is even more fascinating than the hype. By the end of this, you'll understand how a chip can compute using light and why some experts believe it could reshape the future of artificial intelligence, where the extraordinary claims hold up, where they don't, and why one of the biggest shifts in computing history may already be unfolding while much of the world is still looking in the wrong direction. Before we dive in, tell me something in the comments. When you think about the future of technology, what scares you more? The idea that AI keeps advancing too fast, or the possibility that the biggest breakthroughs are happening quietly long before most of us realize what has changed? I read far more of your thoughts than you probably imagine, and sometimes the questions you ask become the reason these conversations continue. And to understand why this story matters, you first have to understand the wall the entire computing industry has been running toward for years now. It isn't a future problem anymore. It is a present one. Every smartphone in your pocket, every laptop on your desk, every server powering the internet, and every Nvidia GPU training the latest AI model works using the same basic principle. Tiny electrical charges, electrons, move through microscopic pathways in billions of transistors, switching on and off at astonishing speeds. That dance of electricity has built the modern world. It put humans on the moon, it gave us the internet, it made artificial intelligence possible, and yet the very thing that brought us this far is beginning to reveal its limits. The first limit is heat. Nobody talks about heat because it isn't glamorous. Investors don't cheer for cooling systems. Headlines aren't written about ventilation, but heat has quietly become one of the biggest enemies of technological progress. The harder you push electrons through a material, the more resistance they encounter, and resistance generates heat. More computing power means more heat, and more heat means more energy spent of cooling machines. Instead of using them, some of the world's most advanced AI data centers now devote staggering amounts of electricity just to keeping their chips from destroying themselves. Think about that for a moment. Entire buildings filled with some of humanity's greatest engineering achievements are spending enormous portions of their energy budget trying to stop their own brains from overheating. That's not efficiency, that's survival. The second problem is energy itself. The AI revolution has a hunger that few people truly appreciate. Training a single cutting-edge language model can consume electricity equivalent to what hundreds of households might use over the course of an entire year. The more capable these systems become, the more power they demand. Some companies have openly discussed building dedicated energy infrastructure to support future data centers. Nuclear power plants are no longer being mentioned as science fiction solutions. They're being discussed as practical necessities. That should make all of us pause. Because no matter how much you love technology or fear it, no system can continue expanding forever if its appetite grows faster than the world's ability to feed it. And that's the question a handful of scientists began asking years ago. Not how do we make electronic chips slightly better, not how do we cool them more efficiently, but what if we stopped relying on electrons altogether? What if the problem wasn't the engineering? What if the problem was the medium itself? Now, this is the point where stories like this usually drift into language that feels impossible to relate to. Photonics, waveguides, optical interference. It starts sounding like something reserved for physicists standing beside whiteboards covered in equations, but the central idea is actually beautiful in its simplicity. Have you ever watched sunlight pass through a prism and split into colors? Have you ever noticed the way ripples intersect on the surface of a pond after two stones break the water? Nature already knows how to combine waves. It already understands patterns. It already performs incredibly precise interactions without instruction from us. Researchers realize something profound. Those interactions can represent mathematics. When beams of light split, shift, interfere, and recombine, they aren't just creating visual effects. Under carefully controlled conditions, they can perform the exact kinds of calculations that artificial intelligence relies on most heavily: the multiplication and accumulation of massive matrices, the repetitive mathematical operations happening millions or billions of times during AI processing. In other words, the universe already knows how to solve these problems. The trick is learning how to ask, I don't know about you, but that's the kind of realization that makes me stop for a second, because sometimes progress isn't forcing nature to obey us. Sometimes it's noticing what nature has been doing all along and learning how to cooperate with it. And if you're the kind of person who enjoys these moments, the ones where science stops feeling like cold machinery and starts feeling almost poetic, consider subscribing. Not because I'm chasing numbers. Honestly, if you've stayed with me this far, you're probably here for the same reason I am. You enjoy looking beneath the headlines to understand how the world actually works. That's a rare kind of curiosity, and I genuinely appreciate sharing these conversations with people who have it. Now imagine two different systems delivering messages. The first is a crowded subway during rush hour. Thousands of commuters squeezing through tunnels, slowing each other down, generating friction, heat, delays. That's electronic computing. Brilliant, adaptable, but increasingly burdened by its own success. The second system is sunlight streaming through open windows. No traffic, no collisions, no waiting in line pre's, just movement. And that's the dream of photonic computing. Instead of wires carrying electrons, microscopic pathways called waveguides direct pulses of light. Tiny optical components split those pulses, delay them, redirect them, and combine them in extraordinarily precise ways. The calculations happen through interference itself, not by flipping billions of tiny electrical switches, but by harnessing the natural behavior of photons moving at the fastest speed the universe permits. It's elegant, it's efficient, and for decades it remained mostly theoretical. Not because scientists doubted physics. Physics was never the problem. Manufacturing was. Because building these systems outside carefully controlled laboratories turned out to be incredibly difficult. Creating one experimental prototype is impressive. Producing thousands reliably is something entirely different. The history of technology is filled with brilliant ideas that never escaped the laboratory because reality proved too messy. Which brings us back to China, because what makes this announcement different isn't simply the performance claim. Researchers have been promising photonic revolutions for years. It's the suggestion that they've begun crossing the bridge from demonstration to production, from possibility to infrastructure. And that distinction changes everything. And according to the teams behind this effort, they have established pilot production capabilities using thin-film lithium niobate wafers, integrating vast numbers of optical components onto a single platform. To most people, that phrase means absolutely nothing, but in manufacturing terms, it means the difference between a handcrafted prototype and the early foundations of an industry. It's the difference between saying, "Look what we built," and asking, "How many can we make?" Those are very different conversations. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Do you remember where you were when you first heard about ChatGPT or Bitcoin or smartphones? Most of us didn't recognize those moments for what they were. They seemed interesting, maybe even overhyped. And then suddenly they weren't niche stories anymore. They were simply part of life. Leave me a comment and tell me honestly, do you think photonic chips belong in that category? Is this another early glimpse of something transformative, or just another fascinating technology that never quite escapes? It's specialized lane. I genuinely read your perspectives because sometimes the smartest observations don't come from experts. They come from people watching the world carefully from the outside. And here's where the story becomes truly interesting, because the headline number 1,000 times faster than Nvidia is real enough to grab attention. But in the next part, we're going to unpack the fine print hiding underneath it. Because extraordinary claims deserve extraordinary context. And the truth behind that number might be even more fascinating than the number itself. Now we arrive at the part of the story where channels usually split into two camps. On one side, you have the people shouting that Nvidia is finished, that China's new chip changes everything overnight, that the AI race is over and someone just crossed the finish line while nobody was paying attention. On the other side, you have people dismissing the entire thing as laboratory hype, another flashy headline attached to technology that will never leave the research papers. The truth, as it usually does, sits somewhere between those extremes. And I think you deserve that version, because the number that pulled all of us into this story, the claim that these photonic chips could be 1,000 times faster than Nvidia's best GPUs, is both true and misleading at exactly the same time. The first piece of fine print is the most important. That 1,000 times advantage does not apply to everything. Not even close. Photonic chips are specialists. They are extraordinarily good at very specific forms of computation and the repetitive mathematical operations sitting at the center of modern AI workloads. Massive matrix multiplications, linear algebra, performed again and again at astonishing scale. For those narrow tasks, the speed advantage can be breathtaking. But ask them to do something outside their specialty, and that advantage begins to disappear. Imagine comparing a Formula One race car to the family SUV parked in your driveway. On a racetrack built precisely for speed, the race car is untouchable. It isn't slightly better, it's embarrassingly faster. But try driving it through a snowstorm, loading groceries into it, taking your children to school, or navigating city traffic. Suddenly, the SUV starts looking pretty useful. That's the reality of this comparison. You know, Nvidia's chips are astonishingly flexible. They can handle gaming, rendering, scientific simulations, language models, image processing, and thousands of different workloads. They are the Swiss Army knives of modern computing. Photonic chips aren't trying to be Swiss Army knives. They're scalpels, extremely sharp, exceptionally efficient, built for a particular kind of work. And if that sounds disappointing, I would argue it's actually more exciting, because specialists change industries all the time. Jet engines didn't eliminate cars. Cameras didn't eliminate books. MRI machines didn't replace stethoscopes. They transformed the areas where they excelled. And AI happens to lean heavily on exactly the kind of mathematics photonic systems seem uniquely suited to accelerate. That's why serious researchers are paying attention. Now, here's the second piece that makes this story harder to dismiss. This isn't one isolated laboratory making extraordinary claims in a vacuum. Multiple Chinese research teams have been publishing increasingly impressive photonic breakthroughs, independent groups demonstrating significant gains in speed and efficiency on narrowly defined AI tasks, different approaches arriving at similar conclusions. That pattern matters. Science becomes more believable when separate teams working independently begin finding the same thing. It doesn't mean technology is inevitable, but it means it deserves respect. I want to pause here for a second because this is one of those moments where I genuinely love hearing what you think. Do breakthroughs like this make you excited, or do they make you uneasy? Because every major leap in technology seems to bring both emotions with it, wonder and worry arriving hand in hand. Drop your honest thoughts in the comments, not the answer you think you're supposed to have, the real one. Because these conversations become richer when people admit they feel both curiosity and uncertainty at the same time. Now let's talk about the caveats, because they're real. Manufacturing yields remain challenging. Long-term durability under sustained industrial workloads still needs to be proven. Integrating photonic systems into existing computing infrastructure presents enormous engineering hurdles. Software ecosystems built around decades of electronic computing won't simply disappear because something faster arrives. History rarely works that way. The better technology doesn't always win immediately. Sometimes it takes years and sometimes decades, and sometimes it becomes part of a hybrid future instead of replacing what came before. And that's actually where I think this story becomes fascinating, because I don't believe we're witnessing the death of silicon. I think we're watching the birth of partnership. Imagine data centers where traditional electronic processors continue doing what they already do exceptionally well, handling flexible, general-purpose workloads requiring adaptability and precision. But when the brutal, repetitive mathematics of AI training arrives, the endless matrix calculations consuming enormous amounts of energy, those workloads get handed over to photonic accelerators built specifically for that purpose. Electrons, where flexibility matters. Photons, where efficiency dominates. The best of both worlds. If that future emerges, it could reshape one of the biggest challenges facing artificial intelligence today. Energy, because beneath every conversation about AI safety, job disruption, creativity, and regulation sits a quieter problem few people discuss often enough: power consumption. The future we imagine for AI only exists if we can afford to run it. If even a fraction of those workloads shift toward dramatically more efficient photonic systems, the implications extend far beyond faster chatbots. Lower energy requirements, reduced cooling demands, more sustainable infrastructure, potentially fewer power plants built solely to support computational growth. This stops being just a technology story. It becomes an environmental one, an economic one, even a geopolitical one. And perhaps that's what fascinates me most. Because for years, the technology race looked straightforward. Who could build smaller transistors? Who controlled the most advanced lithography machines? Who dominated the electronic supply chain? Those were the questions defining the battlefield, but photonic computing changes the battlefield itself. It's like preparing for a marathon only to discover someone else brought a bicycle. Restrictions that matter enormously in one paradigm suddenly lose some of their power in another. And whether you're rooting for China, Nvidia, America, or simply hoping innovation benefits humanity, you have to admit there's something deeply human about that pattern. Obstacles don't always stop progress. Sometimes they redirect it. The roadblock becomes the reason someone builds an entirely different road. I've noticed this happening again and again throughout history. Constraints forcing creativity, scarcity encouraging invention, limitations becoming unexpected catalysts. Maybe that's one of the reasons I find stories like this so compelling, because they aren't really about chips. They're about people refusing to accept that the current way of doing things is the only way. Before we finish, I want to ask you one final question, and I genuinely hope you'll answer it. Do you think the future belongs to light? Do you believe photonic chips will eventually become foundational technology powering the next generation of artificial intelligence? Or do you think electronic chips will remain dominant because versatility matters more than specialization? There isn't a right answer yet, only educated guesses. But sometimes those guesses reveal how we think about progress itself. If you've made it this far, thank you. Truly, there are millions of videos fighting for attention every day. And the fact that you chose to spend part of your evening thinking deeply about technology with me means more than metrics ever could. If these kinds of conversations resonate with you, subscribe, not because I want another number beside a channel name, but because I think there should still be places on the internet where people slow down long enough to understand the world before reacting to it. Places where curiosity matters more than outrage, where nuance isn't treated like weakness, where breakthroughs are examined honestly, without worship and without cynicism. And maybe that's what we're trying to build here together, whatever happens next. Whether photonic computing changes everything or settles into a narrower role, one thing already seems clear. The future isn't arriving in the way most of us expected, and somewhere in laboratories lit by laser beams instead of glowing transistors, people are quietly teaching machines to think with light. The rest of the world may not fully understand what that means yet, but history has a habit of beginning softly, long before anyone realizes they're living through it.